Let's pretend it's the end of this whole ugly story. We vanquished the foe and we triumphed in glory. There's nothing but rainbows and blue skies ahead. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end. We threw off the yoke and we broke all the shackles. We tore down the walls and we burned down the castle. The oppressors all scattered and naked they fled. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end.
Welcome to Before the Future Came, a Star Trek podcast. We're looking at the utopian ideals of Star Trek as we voyage from one work to the next, following a breadcrumb trail of motifs. Last episode we discussed The Sword of Kahless, an episode of Deep Space Nine which had an aging character from the original series. This month, we're talking about an episode which also features a recurring character coming to terms with the end of his career, Sarek, the 23rd episode of Season 3 of Next Generation, written by Peter S. Beagle and directed by Les Landau. I'm Gregory, and I am myself again.
I'm Melissa, and I believe I have the better part of this bargain.
And I'm Lucy, and I slapped Wesley.
Whenever you switch up your intros, it's always something wild. That did happen in this episode, didn't it?
It did.
That's not even on my list. So, Lissa, you picked this week's episode, so please give us a summary in your own words.
Captain's Log, Stardate 43917.4. Ambassador Sarek is coming aboard to finish his decades-long negotiation with folks called the Lagarans. Picard and Riker fanboy about the ambassador coming aboard, including Picard mentioning meeting Sarek at his son's wedding and being super tongue-tied. Before Sarek comes on board, his aides tell Picard and Riker that they should let Sarek remain in seclusion for the duration of the trip because he's not a young man. Picard agrees that nothing will disturb Sarek during the voyage. Lol. Sarek and his wife Perrin come on board, and Sarek immediately disrupts the no disruptions rule by insisting on bopping around the ship, despite his aides and Perrin just about ready to drag him back to his quarters. During their brief tour, Sarek has a really strong reaction to the conference room not being ready yet, pointing out that this is a 93-year effort and everything must be perfect. His entourage soothe him and get him out of the public eye. Next, we see the first instance in this episode, and I will not note all of them, but senior officers just sitting around gossiping about their revered guests in the middle of the bridge.
Just in the bridge, just out loud. Folks looking.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Picard does wish, sadly, that he could have the opportunity to experience Sarek's thoughts and his memories and his unique understanding of the history he's made.
That line.
So good and so corny. So, still trying to avoid disturbing Sarek, Picard invites Perrin, Sarek's wife, to the concert that night that was supposed to be in Sarek's honor. We find out that Sarek hasn't been able to meditate for several weeks, which any long-term Star Trek fan knows is very bad news. But guess who tags along to the concert any damn way? Before the concert, we see LaForge and Wesley Crusher, who had been working together just fine several minutes earlier, nearly come to blows over Crusher's enthusiasm for a date. I do think LaForge actually winds up when Crusher says, "At least I don't have to find my women on the holodeck."
Yeah, lots of people wanting to hit Wesley in this episode.
I think he did all right. Riker comes in and everyone goes their own ways. The concert goes great. Data's good at the violin, as you'd expect, and Sarek cries, and both Picard and Troy notice. Oops. We hear about and see a few more incidences of random aggression, like the argument between the two of them, between LaForge and Crusher, including Mama Crusher slapping Baby Crusher. She tells Troy that she slapped him really hard, and I have to disagree. I think.
You don't think that was a very hard slap?
No, absolutely not. At this point, Sarek's aides, specifically Saketh, the Vulcan aide, suggest that maybe Sarek isn't going to be able to complete the negotiations. Just, sort of asking around about who all can do diplomatic stuff. So at this point, Dr. Crusher and Troy are on the case of figuring out this violence and this aggression and land on Sarek maybe having Bindai syndrome. He might be just pushing out emotions to random people, and it could happen to the Ligarans. So they can't confirm it quickly, so they try to delay the conference. Picard and Data tangle with these aides. There's one human aide named Mendrozin who threatens Picard's career, and then the Vulcan aide just sort of crumples like a wet napkin and reveals he's been helping Sarek bundle up his emotions this whole time. When Picard confronts Perrin with the idea that Sarek has the syndrome, they have a conversation in which she almost entirely has her back to him, which is super weird. It's very, very
Star Trek staging.
Yeah, it felt like this whole episode, we'll surely talk about the performances, but this felt very original series in some of its acting. But Sarek denies that Sarek's ill, but Sarek comes in and is like, hey, what's up? Turns out he did not know that he was being assisted, which is a little awkward. So Picard and Sarek have this conversation where Picard basically has to meet his hero where he lives today. Sarek requests logical evidence. Picard sort of provides it. Sarek starts getting real heated about what he calls coincidences. And the conversation devolves into Sarek shouting and kind of becoming somewhat incoherent. He's just shouting illogical in a way that doesn't make sense. So Picard's trying to sort out what to do with these negotiations that are super important, and he and Perrin sort out that one idea is that Picard and Sarek maintain a mind meld during the treaty discussions. Nobody particularly likes the idea. Sarek says his emotions are too strong. Dr. Crusher says it's too dangerous, and they do it anyway. And what follows is the initiation of one of the most famous mind meld scenes in all of Star Trek, including us getting to see Sarek be quite Picard-like and calling Riker number one, and his voice even changes a little bit. It's so good. I know we're going to talk about his acting later, but holy shit. And then we see Picard go through it. Aside from Crusher being in the room, it's practically just a one-man show of Picard hopping from thought to emotion and back again.
And it's mostly one long take.
Yes, it's mostly, and it's so good. He talks about like the hell of getting older and his love for Spock and Amanda and Perrin and various regrets. The treaty negotiations happen completely off-screen. We don't see a Ligaran. We know that, the conference room had a big pool in it of liquid for them. We don't know what they look like.
To us, it's a slime pool. To them, it's home.
It's home.
A boiling slime pool. 150 degrees Celsius slime pool?
I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I think it's 150 degrees.
Wild. So as the episode wraps, Picard exchanges some really heartfelt goodbyes with both Perrin and Sarek. And Sarek speculates this is the last time he will see Picard. As they are leaving, we see Sarek fully holding Perrin's hand as they are transported out. And then we cut to credits. It's not a Vulcan two-finger kiss. He fully holds her hand.
That's scandalous.
Ooh, it's love.
So, before we get into the episode, we've established a Sarek scale on this show.
Oh.
On a scale from Sarek to Sarek, how was Sarek in this episode?
He's pretty damn Sarek.
He was pretty Sarek, but he wasn't dadding, which was part of the metric, yeah.
Yeah, so not very concerned with kids. He does mention Spock, doesn't mention Michael, which I prefer to think is because the thing that he is very much focusing on is not betraying her by revealing her role in history, and that like he's willing to give everything else up, but keeping Michael close to his chest.
Yes.
There's a way in which Picard is sort of a stand-in for children, right? Because he admires Sarek. He's kind of a father figure in some ways.
Hero worshipping him, yeah.
We've each brought a topic for discussion. Mine is, I guess, Bendai syndrome, but really the concept of madness in this episode. I thought originally when they said that they thought he was sick, that he had a disease, I thought that was very interesting because if you look at the symptoms of that disease, it's basically that he is experiencing emotions, right? And not being able to repress them. And
leaking them to other people.
And leaking them. But so that's complex, right? Because we don't all think about having, expressing, and even sharing emotions as being a disease. But because Vulcan culture has decided that it's that way, that's the way it is.
Wait, Lucy, are you implying that madness is some sort of socially constructed phenomenon?
Well, I really wasn't going to imply it. I was just going to say it. Because I mean, I guess one thing and I'm a longtime Star Trek viewer, but I hadn't thought as much about the cultural construction of emotion on Vulcan and for Vulcans. But they say in the episode that Vulcans do have the same basic emotions that we do. They have just learned to repress them. So that emotional detachment is core to their identity, sort of their cultural identity as Vulcans, right? So when you think about it from that way, it makes sense that they pathologize the condition of being unable to repress one's emotions. And that reminded me a lot of Madness and Civilization by Mikhail Foucault, who really argued that mental illness and a lot of maybe other things that we medicalize are social constructions. So I reread Madness and Civilization today.
As one does.
Yeah, you just can't put it down, sort of a page turner. And I had forgotten, but it was really interesting that Foucault begins his exploration of madness with the concept of the ship of fools and an insane crew. And that, of course, is resonant with Star Trek, which has a sort of naval theme, and we do have a crew. In this case, not an insane crew, but a crew that is being impacted by this sort of mental issue going on with Sarek.
And Star Trek has a long legacy of having the crew has gone insane and is stuck on the ship, right? Sulu with the sword. A season. Yeah. So, yeah, that's good tradition.
For sure. And Foucault also makes references to some Shakespearean, I mean, of course, Cervantes too. You can't not think about tilting at windmills with this, but also to Shakespeare in Macbeth. The doctor in Macbeth says about Lady Macbeth, "This disease is beyond my practice," because she is sick in her heart, right? She has committed murder, or was party to murder in any case. If he had not looked like her father, she'd have done it. And so even in Shakespeare, there's this sort of construction of mental illness as a disease, but as a disease that is kind of beyond what we're able to diagnose and even treat. And that was true in this episode, too. They said that they didn't have a cure. I mean, here we are in the far future, and they have all of these amazing technologies, but they don't have a cure for this. And part of that is because it is a social construction of perhaps a condition that calling it a disease is saying something. And I'm not saying that it's not a disease, but I am saying that it's more complex than just saying this is a medical biological condition.
Yeah, they have a test for it, but it takes too much time. They can't do the test on his brain tissue in time to diagnosed before the negotiations.
Yeah, for the diagnosis part. But there's not a treatment. They say that there's not a treatment for it at all. Mm-hmm. I also thought another thing that was fascinating in Madness in Civilization is the way that Foucault correlates madness and institutionalization with work. That it's about idleness, right? If you can't work, if there is something in the way you're behaving that means that you can't work, that's the problem. And it really did make me think further about this episode and the way in which work is even construed for Sarek, right? Because they're not even thinking about him as a person, like what's happening to him as a person. They're thinking about who's going to do this diplomatic negotiation. This work is important. And how is this work going to be reflected in his legacy, right? So it's all very wrapped up in these ideas of work and how he's valued as a worker, and not how he is experiencing this condition as a human person or a Vulcan person, right?
I think Perrin might be the exemption from that. I think she's also concerned with his legacy, but kind of through the lens of his perception of his legacy, rather than a hero worship perspective. You know, she's like, my husband wants to do this. It's still about the work, but it is a little more, you know, of a partner-y type of thought than I work for Sarek and need to do this thing.
For sure. Foucault also talks about the secrecy and the shame that come from hiding away madness and the way people seek to, you know, hide away. He's talking about the history of institutionalization and the ways we try to hide people who have been diagnosed as having certain mental conditions. And I thought that was interestingly related to this episode as well, because it does seem to be a shameful thing, right? Like Sarek himself seems to view it as shameful. I mean, I think they all do seem to view this as a matter of shame, which, you know, it's not. Like, it doesn't seem, one, that he's done this on purpose. I suspected that there would be a lot of correlations from Madness and Civilization in this episode, but I was sort of surprised by how many of Foucault's thoughts about madness were reified in this episode.
Yeah. In support of the whole, like, how much of a biological disease is Bendai syndrome? You know, are we talking, you know, how socially constructed is this situation? There's an episode of Lower Decks where a Vulcan crew member named T'Lyn has a Bendai syndrome-like episode. And in her case, it is completely psychosomatic. Like, she is stressed and insecure, and that triggers a break in which she's projecting her emotions in a way that, like, textually they call it Bendai syndrome, even though she's like, that only happens to old people. And so, like, if it's a disease that can show up completely outside of its normal pathology, what does that say about these symptoms, these signs?
Yeah, and it made me think about, I don't have a lot of knowledge about dementia or Alzheimer's, but it made me think of some of the fuzziness of what seems, maybe just colloquially, the bucket that is dementia. One of the things in it is Alzheimer's, right? And Alzheimer's, I think you can see on a scan, right? It's spots or spotches or something, right? But dementia is this bucket that it seems very, like, socially constructed, right? Like, I can think of a list of things, but I can also think of a list of things for conditions that don't actually exist, right? Or conditions that aren't in medical textbooks as such. And this sort of play here of like, what is Sarek allowed to decide for himself and what must be decided for him? I'm quite sure we're going to get into that more, but it all seemed very linked. Like, I remember being surprised at the time that they didn't go after just basically Vulcan Alzheimer's, because Vulcans supposedly have perfect memory, right? So it would have made we see a little faltering of memory here, but not the way you would expect. But they went for emotions instead, which was, I think, an appropriate move for the thing they're doing. But yeah, equally amorphous.
I mean, to part of your point about dementia, I remember my grandmother all the time losing things, and she would say, "Oh, it's dementia. It's dementia." And I would be like,
Yes.
"Grandma, I lost my keys this morning too, and I don't have dementia," like, but, she was telling a story that included that, right? Because she was in her 70s and she was losing things. And so that was a story that she was telling, and I think a socially constructed story. I don't know that losing her keys was actually a sign of dementia, right?
Right.
And I think this episode raises some questions, and I mean, I hesitate to frame this as a disappointment, but it was almost a disappointment to me in some ways, because it really suggested to me the ways in which Vulcans are framed as being very human, right? Like, their issues with emotions are the same as ours. They're not actually different, right? It's just a different social construction.
I did some volunteering at an Alzheimer's home when I was in high school, and the emotional outburst that Sarek has, where it concludes with him shouting illogical, that's definitely, I suspect, is meant to reflect how people with dementia will kind of break down, and when they kind of have to confront some of the stuff that they're going through, that emotional deregulation often happens with just like shouting and confusion, because it's really it seems like a very rough situation to be in.
Well, I've known two people recently who have suffered from dementia or Alzheimer's, and I do think it's interesting the ways in which dementia or Alzheimer's just sort of accentuates the part of you that were already there, right? Like, the ways in which it just is like you are less able to cover up things about yourself.
Yeah.
Thinking about life after one's career, whether it's, fifth grade teacher or whatever, I want to talk about sort of retiring heroes in Star Trek. We have now twice watched episodes, and probably more than twice, but our last episode, The Sword of Kahless, featured an elderly Klingon named Kor, who was sort of on his last hurrah to get the sword. And then, of course, this episode has Sarek on his last hurrah to complete this mission. I don't think we'd ever heard of this race of folks before.
Nope.
This just kind of came out of the blue. Yep. That's cool. That's fine. And so both of these episodes have folks kind of desperate to hold on to their capstone missions as they become increasingly impossible. Where, does this, the Sword of Kahless in particular is like, is it going to be here? Can we get it? What are our obstacles, etc.? And the ways in which Sarek's mission become impossible are legitimately surprises to everyone involved, right? Like, this just slips and slides out of everyone's hands. And both of them get so desperate. Like, at one point, in that sort of scene in which he's shouting at Picard, he says, "I must be allowed to complete my mission. There are no other logical solutions." Which people in Star Trek just use the word logical around Vulcans in an argument, and it means nothing. There's nothing logical. That's gotta
be annoying to a Vulcan. Be like, you don't know what you're talking. Logic I know logic. You haven't been through logic catechism.
Yeah. And so I think Star Trek is interested in a society where people get old enough to live between working and dying. And that kind of struck me as interesting because I kind of think of not being able to retire as a more modern concept than 1990, right? Like, it's sort of our generation that's like, whoo, we're going to be working till we're 75, right? At least half time. because Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe I should just say Americans of this generation. Yeah. The rest of the world is probably doing better. But we've seen that, or at least we do see, especially in Next Generation, that our main characters have trouble imagining what their lives will be like after this current phase of their life, right? Like, what does Picard think he's going to be doing? I mean, Kirk, right? Kirk's the whole thing with all the movies is, what is Kirk doing when he's too old to be being a captain? And the answer is still trying to be a captain.
There's an entire series about Picard's adventures, not just retiring and making wine.
Right. And so when we kind of look at these heroes and what they're about, Star Trek continues to sort of carry forward the bias of deflation, like, and it's over, like this sort of sadness, this sort of grief. You know, Perrin says, like, help him regain his pride. And she's talking about the illness, but she's also talking about his mission and his work. And it's an unfortunate, it's a particularly unfortunate thing, as if life after these epic grand adventures must be a disappointment. Yeah. And it's surprisingly, I mean, I think it ties to the idea of work as a sense of value, right? Giving your life purpose is work, and that transitioning either to not working or doing a different kind of work is a lessening in stature or value or quality. But the idea, like, during the mind meld, we have Picard as Sarek saying, like, one of the things he says is, I'm so old. There's nothing left but dry bones and dead friends. And it's like, this man is 202 years old. He has survived a wife. He has survived a son. I haven't seen the Star Trek Finds God movie in a long time. I don't know if Spock's brother
yeah,
lives.
I don't remember how he turns out.
But Spock is gone. Michael is gone, right? Like, he has lived a long life, and it's not 100% clear to me that his grief is, you know, is his grief only about the disease, or is it also about his life's work being done? I think it's a little tangled up. And so in some ways it was disappointing, right? Like, I like to think of Star Trek and Star Trek's utopian vision of society not just being the romp of the adventures of the Enterprise crew, right? Like, it should span more than what is colonization, like how's the Federation helping people live better or worse or whatever, but to have more longevity there. And this episode doesn't show it, especially with tying it, you know, Sarek's departure is considered to be his departure from life as well, as, you know, he thinks this is the last time he's going to get to see Picard again. So it was a bit of a letdown, as much as I love the episode. It's kind of sad.
There's just a sort of very basic ageism in the portrayal of the world here. Like,
yes,
my topic is about aging with dignity. Dignity is a word that gets tossed around a lot in this episode, and there's this I think that one of the things that everyone is concerned about, including Sarek, is sort of being perceived as different because one has succumbed to these issues of aging. And it's repeatedly framed in terms of dignity. And since my my segments tend to be about me talking about the meaning of virtues and similar things, when we talk about dignity, what that actually means, when like people are advocating for dignity for the elderly, dignity for the ill, they're talking about being treated as people with agency, who have the ability to choose their own path, who have the authority to choose their own path, who are treated with the same courtesies that we treat other people because of this inherent worth that they have as a person, right? So not to have all your stuff exposed just because you need help, to be able to decide where you go, what you do, whether you go to a concert or not. That's dignity. So dignity is about how people treat you. And the fact that all like Picard and Riker and a bunch of other people are very worried about taking away this man's dignity by publicizing, by letting people know that he is ill, that's like there's an assumption there that they know that once this is known, that people will treat Sarek differently, right? Because having his dignity taken away is not something inherent to him, right? He's not going to give away his dignity. It's that when the secret is out, he will lose his dignity because people will take it away from him. And so, like, the Star Trek world isn't envisioning a world without labor, or isn't envisioning life without labor, and isn't envisioning a world in which you can be an old person who's experiencing age-related troubles and are treated just like a person with agency and the right to privacy and all of these things. And I find it's especially interesting because, according to some behind-the-scenes stuff, Gene Roddenberry was going through some age-related stuff as well, considering retirement, kind of stepping further and further back from the show. And some of the creators kind of considered this a little bit of an homage to Roddenberry, bringing back Sarek and dealing, doing something with relation to, like, here's this awesome person who's not going to be doing the work that they were doing forever. And it's interesting that even knowing that they had Roddenberry in their head, they weren't envisioning a world in which, people weren't like, oh, it's fine. We have geriatric care. Like, we know how to treat old people like people.
Yeah, no, they were like, put him in the canoe and kick him off the shore. Like, go fish, right? Like,
and, yeah, I mean, they're not that awful. Like, they are dealing with a direct, concrete, like, can we do this negotiation when he can't control himself?
Right.
But, yeah, there's definitely that implication of, like, and this will be the last time he ever gets to go outside.
And there's, like you mentioned, the secrecy, right? Like, they're all kind of sworn to secrecy on keeping this because this is a source of shame. And I think that idea that this is in some way shameful is for me, the issue there, right? Because why should it be shameful? Like, why should that be a shameful thing? You can see that in all sorts of ways, in our culture. And that's, like, I think something that's being reflected and reified in Star Trek culture, because it's so firmly embedded in our culture, that we should feel a sense of shame about these sorts of pathologized ideas that we don't need to feel shame about. Not that it's, but I just like to make a non-age related analog, because I think we've already talked about, Alzheimer's, which I know a person with Alzheimer's for whom it is a sort of deep source of shame to the point of denial about it. And dementia is the same. But I was just talking with somebody the other day about like menstrual cycle issues and how people often feel this deep sense of shame about, like, well, even being on your period, or if you're having problems, like, oh, well, let's keep this hush hush, like, why? There's no shame in this perfectly normal thing that happens to people. And if we don't, like, if everything is shameful, then, you know, I don't know, then
Yeah.
then what?
Yeah, you get that shame, that like that pathologized situation that you're in, and then this is like intersecting oppressions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're old and you have this mental illness, if you know, this thing that we call a mental illness, then that is a sign that you are old in a way that means that you have to start stepping back, have to give up control. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it does feel like I like this episode a lot. It feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to be like, you can be like, hey, Vulcans live 250, 300 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how Vulcans handle senescence, given that, like,
right.
they do age and die, but not as fast as humans do. Like, do they have a different perspective on it because of that? Like, they're longer lived than most species that we encounter in Star Trek, and so, like, they should be used to seeing people get old and die.
And what's ultimately the great tragedy? That he's feeling things? I mean, I don't know. I feel things deeply every day. I guess I live a tragedy every day. You know, like, I don't... I understand that culturally it's, like, really, you know, it's not right in the culture. But it is, in some ways, it's kind of a terrible thing to make a source of shame. And I think the episode, like... it really gets into that, right? Like the pain that repression is causing is part of it.
I think when we look at what the source of... I think it's unfair to say that having emotions is the problem. The problem is he is shouting at people. He is exploding. He is causing violence. Not that should be a source of shame, but I think it is more than he feels emotions, right? It's him again shouting at Picard. Like, that's different, and I hope that you aren't doing that every day.
Well, yeah, I mean, I am not much of a shouter, but I would say, though, that they've created a sort of unhealthy situation for him, right? Because what tools is he being offered to help him regulate? Like, he's not able to express these emotions in any way. So that's going to lead to this sort of emotional dysregulation that's happening. So, I mean, I don't think it's like, this is a whole situation, a powder keg, right? That's been created because there's no way forward outside of pathologizing it.
To a certain extent, but I mean, they demonstrate here, and we have seen elsewhere in Star Trek, that, like, one of the tools he has is meditation. And it's not working, right? So, and he has an aide who can assist, right? So there are tools, and those tools are not working. And I think when he goes back to Vulcan, they're probably going to try other tools, right? They're not going to bury this living man in a casket, right? Or burn him up and put his katra in wherever they put it. Like, they're going to do more things than we have this 12-hour period in which something has to be done to mitigate the situation.
And I want to put on my moral relativism hat for a second and at least voice what Star Trek would defend itself with regarding emotion and Vulcans, which is that for most Vulcans don't get Bendai syndrome, right? This is incredibly rare. There hasn't been a case of it in hundreds and hundreds of years. And for most Vulcans, suppressing their emotions is healthy, right? Like, we can disagree with morality stuff, but, like, most Vulcans live completely healthy their entire lives, suppressing their very violent and dramatic emotions, right? The reason they suppress it is because if they don't suppress it, then they believe that they will get expressed in very unhealthy ways. And the Romulans are the counterpart to that, right? The way the Romulans express their feelings and emotions, because they're very, they're almost the same species. end up creating these structures of power that are really dangerous that the Vulcans avoid by suppressing those emotions. And like the issue isn't that he's feeling things, I think, if you ask Sarek, right? The issue isn't that he's feeling things, it's that he can't control how he expresses those feelings. And like Sarek probably would say having those emotions be conscious, having those emotions, being aware of them is itself maybe shameful, but definitely bad. And I think that's one of the eternal questions of Star Trek is, are the Vulcans right about emotion? Which I feel like we might talk about a little later on. But I think that there's the very carefully constructed plot situation here is one in which the show has the excuse of going, well, we do need to handle this now, and we don't have the time to bring in proper support structures. Mm-hmm. Which, like, they chose to write the story that way.
Right. Yeah, I think that ageism and so on is so unexamined, and that is what makes it tough. And this makes me think of an example, this is completely off script, of a work that is far more, at least so far that I've seen, more considered in its idea of what is life after your great work. And that is the anime Frieren.
Ah.
So Lucy and I have watched the first 8 episodes.
Correct.
And it's, if you haven't seen it, listener, it is an anime with weird pacing that's very cool. If you have heard of it, you've probably heard of it from 6 podcasts like I have. It's bizarre.
Or your brother-in-law like I have.
Yes.
The full title, I think the English title tends to be Frieren Beyond Journey's End. In Japanese, it's more like The Funeral of Frieren or Funeral Frieren.
Oh, interesting. And so basically, the story takes place after a grand adventuring party is done. Like, they've gone on a 10-year journey and fought their battles and did their thing, and now they've returned to society, and one of the members is an elf who lives a very, very long time, has lived long before their adventures, and will continue to live on. And so this is sort of following her and the people she kind of picks up along the way, and her sort of slow, sort of methodical way of navigating the world in this, what to a human seems like a retirement era. And it is so much more thoughtful and considered about what does it mean for a longer-lived person to just keep going and not have to prove themselves every 5 minutes. Although she does.
She does prove herself.
Yes.
Even though she doesn't need to.
No.
She's not really worried about proving herself.
Right. And that's part of it. Like, part of, I think, Star Trek's, this was a problem in Sword of Kahless, this is a problem in Picard. The idea that you have to keep proving yourself over and over again throughout your whole life until the very end is rough and unchallenged. Like, there's not much in the writing that changes that sort of system. It's disappointing.
Well, we've taken care of the big topics, so let's do a quick lightning round of the other things that we were thinking about with this episode. Lissa, you want to go first?
I want to talk about honesty. This episode gives us, like, a poker hand straight flush of honesty examples, by which I mean dishonesty examples. So, first, we have Mendrozen, who is the human aide, who is the most Babylon 5 ass character I've seen in
I was trying to figure out what was up with him.
His costuming, he's got this like heavily patterned, shiny, broad-shouldered costume. His voice has that, oh god, what are their names? The people with the fan hair in Babylon 5?
Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah,
Veer and that other
Veer
guy.
is one of them, yeah.
And something about the way he talks when he's sitting in the chair and he's threatening Picard's career.
Yeah,
he has
this
that
is
performance.
This is the dude who shows up to Babylon 5 and, like, sells a magic box that it turns out contains a space demon or something.
Yes. And he is called in when absolute lighting is needed. Mm-hmm. Like, he just will sit and lie to your face. Like, and it's all, okay,
he's not
so
sick.
I guess he's not sick. Absolutely not. And also, keep your mouth shut or your career's, at risk. And Vulcans, ostensibly, do not or cannot lie. And so, that is why the human is, it's by that dichotomy,
yeah.
he is the one who is the liar.
I hadn't thought about
Saketh,
that.
Saketh is the Vulcan aide, who is clearly young, especially relative to Sarek. He is very awkwardly deceptive. He goes and interfaces with Data and asks Data, hey, what happened? Could you tell me what Picard and Troy's credentials are for running diplomatic missions, right? For holding treaty discussions. And Data, I'll get to Data in a moment, but, Saketh is clearly setting up something and doesn't want to give up the secret, but, like, he's obvious, but he's also being deceptive in a certain way. He's being as deceptive as a Vulcan would hopefully try to be. And then we've got Perrin, and Perrin gives the perception, at least, of being more in denial than lying. She's lying to herself. And I think it's thin. I don't know if this is going to come up when we talk about gender troubles, but this sort of wifely situation she's in. So she's another sort of space here that is different than the hero worship kind of lie, but kind of falls in the slot of lying to herself. And then the last one I think is worth noting is Data, who just, like, takes this conversation and in a way that is, I think, kind of one of the most, like, it's very human of him to just go ahead and run that deduction. Like, he's not here to pretend at a very literal thing. He's like, obviously you are setting up for someone else needing to run this. Which is, Picard does great by just sicking Data back on Saketh to finish that conversation. But Star Trek is often interested in honesty, and it's interested in, like, are the Klingons brutally honest when they interact with each other? Like, who's gentle with their honesty? Who's just gonna lie? What are the Ferengi, right? Like, it's a whole thing.
Speaking of the Romulans, you get the truth nuns.
Yep. And you get there's some interesting original series stuff with Romulans that delves into this sort of play-acting honesty thing. Star Trek is interested in that space, and I think it does a very, very good job here of setting up this spectrum of characters of each different kinds of dishonest and sort of letting them play to their advantages. Like, I think Mendrozin, like, I was mad. He is such a jerk. Like, he's so mean. And he plays the role perfectly. I have some questions for Saketh's actor, but everyone did their best.
Playing a Vulcan's hard. Playing a Vulcan's gotta be hard,
eyes.
especially when you're up against Mark Leonard.
I know, right? There's only so much you can do. So, yes, anyway, honesty, I think when we have future episodes that talk about honesty or have relevant things, I think we should think back to this and the way this is, like, very deliberately and clearly structured. And where Picard is left sort of standing in the middle, trying to weave all of this together into something coherent, when he goes and confronts Perrin and ultimately Sarek in that sort of give me your logical deductions about what's happening conversation, in which Sarek both does and does not want the truth in that conversation. So
I thought it was interesting that Picard sent Data to go and talk to the Vulcan, and
Yes.
Data was the one who was like, let me just put it to you in logic. I'm just gonna binary this out for you.
Yep.
We got two people without emotion, or two people who do not express emotions, having a discussion with each other, which is kind of cool and relatively rare in Star Trek to have two different neurodivergent aliens having a conversation.
It was a nice moment because the Vulcan just all of a sudden changed his mind and was like, oh yeah, you're right, there's a problem here. Go ahead and let Picard know. Red alert. Shields up.
Yes. I thought Sacketh was pretty adorable, honestly. He's just like, trying to make shit work in a bad situation.
Well, I'm afraid that I've got to talk about it. This episode has some gender stuff going on in it that I felt as if I saw an omen when I saw Picard and Riker in their dress uniforms, which, especially early on in Next Generation, the dress uniforms are these tunics that sort of look dress-like. They're a very long top, that goes down to like mid-thigh or lower, and then has like, I think maybe at this point has black leggings under it still, and is very reminiscent of the scant uniform that showed up mostly in the first season, where both masculine and feminine crew members would wear these could wear a version of the uniform that had a skirt included in it. And sort of one of the last remnants of this is this kind of goofy looking dress uniform design, in my opinion, that feels like very straight lines down to the skirt. I don't know about that.
It needed something to break it up.
And I will just remind folks, too, that in the third season, it's better than the first and second season in the quality of the uniform, the material, but it is not yet up to the quality that you'll see in season 5 and beyond, so they're really a little bit form-fitting, and you can see Riker's tummy, which, I'll be honest, is pretty sexy, but you won't see that. Like, materials change, right, on the later seasons.
Yeah. But it's very, like, to me, emblematic of the way that Next Generation thinks about gender, to be like, well, gender equality is that sometimes the men wear skirts. And then very shortly after that, we get introduced to Perrin. Perrin, who does not have a last name. So Sarek's wife, Perrin, is first addressed as Mrs. Sarek, which is particularly wild because Klingons don't have surname, or not, Vulcans don't have surnames. Klingons also kind of don't. What's that?
That's not quite true. They got last names.
They got long names, right?
Yeah, they got, an original series, I think and Journey to Babel, which is where I think we first meet Sarek in original series. I can't believe I know this. I'm so sorry.
You just got actually.
I did just actually. We are told that their names are unpronounceable, but courtesy of a book, which then becomes canon in what's the one we're watching? Strange New Worlds, Spock is actually introduced with a family name, and thus we're in this space of last names are unpronounceable or family names are unpronounceable in canon at this point, so they would just go with Sarek.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. Please cut all of this.
No.
I definitely will not.
So properly, she should be Perrin, unpronounceable name, right? Like,
yes.
If you're like, okay, in a human-Vulcan marriage, she's gonna take his family name, which in and of itself is wild, because, like, why? At this point in Next Gen, we're still assuming that humans take on their partner's last name when they marry. The women do. But that bit was like, whoa, Mrs. Sarek? Because, like, she's got a surname. We just never learn it. Right. And it wouldn't be Sarek in any case. And we get that, like, the roles of women in this episode and in Next Generation in general are very limited. You've got the caring wife who's supportive and is, always with her hand on her husband's shoulder and being his advocate and, like, getting him to go out to social situations, but, like, she does no commentary whatsoever on the negotiations, right? She's an ambassador's wife, but she's not doing any diplomacy herself and isn't even really doing administrative work, right? Like, this isn't a job that she's doing. Troy I think is very useful this episode because it's an episode about figuring out where emotions are.
Speaking
And that
of
asymmetrical
outfits,
neckline, that is
Oh my
fire.
God.
Oh, I didn't notice
Yes.
it. Did she have a good outfit this episode?
Yes, it's so good.
Did you see her belt line, her waistline, also asymmetrical to match?
Yes.
Oh my God, it was amazing.
I love it. It's really good.
First note. First note about Troy is holy shit, that outfit. And then also she's good in this episode.
I look forward to. I'll be. We do. I try and pull images from the episode to put in the show notes. So if you're just reading the show notes in your podcatcher, you won't see the images. So there will be a link to the post. I'm looking forward to putting up the picture of that so I can admire the fashion. But yeah. Troy does get stuff to do, which isn't. A lot of the times, Next Generation does not use her very well, but she still just kind of has the role as counselor and confidant. Beverly Crusher just has the job of, I mean, doctor is an important, prestigious job, but still she's in the caregiver category, right? She
mom.
is support and mom, yeah. Yes, mom who is mind controlled into hurting her kid, and yeah, so you've got the main woman character introduced in the episode doesn't even have a surname. LaForge and Wesley Crusher are arguing about women.
I hated that so much.
Wesley is got a date with Suzanne Dumont, which in itself is weird because Wesley's like 16 at this point, right?
No, I think he's given the label of ensign. No, he can't have gone to the academy yet. Yeah, so
okay, so maybe he's 18 and is still an acting ensign from his kind of weird field commission he gets.
Yeah.
That also, I'll confirm that in show notes, is his age. But like he talks about having a date with an officer, which I think is fine, work chat. But then LaForge is like, yeah, she's good looking. She's something like that, comments just out in the open on a coworker's appearance. And then later on, when sort of their tensions are artificially high, LaForge says, you really don't think anything's going to happen with Suzanne Dumont. Like, LaForge is like, the whole point of going on a date with someone is to have sex with them or smooches or whatever at the end of it. And then Wesley snaps back with a comment about Leia Brahms and saying, at least I don't have to get women on the holodeck. And like, all these, like, those two talk about women like they are objects, right? Like, this classic objectification.
Geordi says, compared to you, every male on this ship is an expert on women, which is perhaps the worst line.
Also, factually untrue. Are we supposed to believe that Barclay is more experienced with women than Wesley?
It's also it's so heteronormative. It's just, I don't know, it just doesn't feel good.
Yeah, it was unclear to me in several of these. Like, okay, so we see Crusher hit Crusher, and she's like, I wasn't thinking anything, right? I just snapped. It was random anger. And it was unclear to me if we were supposed to take the LaForge Crusher conversation as being like, these aren't even things they would think. You know what I mean? Are we supposed to believe that this is all sort of handed to it's hard to believe, because
maybe, I mean,
it's hard to believe.
That makes me want to do a reading where all of the conflicts that the people have are representations of some inner aspect of Sarek's psyche, and where like Sarek is feeling weird and horny, and so I don't know that it holds up, but that's a weird and interesting reading.
Yeah. That was gross. Yeah.
Yeah. To the episode's credit, one of the members of the string quartet is a woman, and at least one of the people in the bar fight is a woman. But like, this episode feels like it isn't even thinking about the very real gender dynamics that exist with the man in a heterosexual marriage is aging, and his younger wife is sort of in the position of assumed caregiver, and like, it just isn't interested in talking about any of that.
I mean, and I thought the very worst part of that was another line I think it's toward the end when Sarek says Perrin can be quite logical when she chooses. That is an extraordinarily patronizing thing to say. And although I understand that their dynamic is Vulcan and human, that is also so gendered, right? Like, to act like the woman is emotional, she can be logical when she chooses. It just felt so gross. Like, why is Sarek choosing all these human women that he can be patronizing toward about their emotions? Is really kind of terrible when you think about it.
I thought several times, and I don't remember how Amanda is represented in this era of Star Trek and before, but I was thinking of the Amanda, Sarek's first wife, from Strange New Worlds and Discovery, and like the thought of him treating Amanda like he treated Perrin is unimaginable. Like, that woman would not stand for this sort of thing. And yeah, weird.
Yeah, original depictions of Amanda were, I think the dynamic had to be different because she was interfacing with Spock typically, right? And you've got a certain mom energy there that's like, hey, don't act too uppity, you think you got big britches on because you've left home, whatever. But she still wasn't nearly as interesting as she is in newer Star Treks. But yeah, that vibe is, I mean, it's part of the really bad writing around Vulcans, right? The Ponfar, the meek wives, right? Like, this whole era of Star Trek is kind of chock full of gross gender shit about Vulcans.
Pretty well retconned by the time of Strange New Worlds. I feel like they're doing a lot better with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually a pretty good segue into talking about what I want to talk about, which is violence and emotion. And maybe y'all can just help me tease it out, because it was already helpful what Gregory said earlier about like the reason why Vulcans suppress their emotions so much. But, you know, the plot B, which is really part of plot A on the show, is all this violent tension that's erupting all over the ship. And that's when you have Dr. Crusher slapping Wesley, which I by the way, gasped.
It's
when that happened.
Sudden, and like, it's not a hard hit, but I did not expect it to go there.
I wasn't expecting it either. And then, and how Worf was like, I hadn't noticed. And then when they open the door to 10 forward and there's literally a brawl broken out, and he says, I see what you mean. And I just have I was struggling about it because, so it turns out that these are Sarek's emotions that are being telepathically communicated to everyone. So is the message that, like, we can't control, like, we're gonna be violent? Like you, because I think we said this earlier, I mean, her slapping Wesley like that was so out of character. I mean, just so out of character. And then also, I mean, I'm a mom, and I challenge the Vulcan to telepath something to me that will cause me to do that, because it just doesn't seem reasonable to me. I feel angry. I mean, we get hit with emotions, but I don't think we have to become violent when confronted with those. So I really struggled with what this episode was saying about emotions and violence.
Yeah, we don't see any other sorts of emotions transferred, I don't think. We don't have anyone breaking down crying in the halls. Like, Sarek is moved at the concert, and we don't, like, cut to, someone in the mess hall weeping.
Yeah. Right, couldn't we have had Dr. Crusher being like, oh, Wesley, I'm so glad to see you. I love you so much. I'm overcome with my love for you. And that would have been emotion that would have been more in character for her, right? But that's not what the episode chooses.
So maybe specifically that is the Bendai syndrome, that, like, it causes violence. That's how it's portrayed in... I don't remember if it's just violence in Lower Decks or not. It's definitely, like, out of control things that manifest mostly in violent ways, but I don't remember. There's definitely, I think you're right that there is an equation, an equating
Equivalency?
of, yeah. They're saying that when you get emotional, you get violent. Even though there's a whole lot of emotions. There wasn't anyone just laughing uncontrollably.
Yeah, it's not until the mind meld that we see the broader spectrum, right?
Mhm.
So that makes me think about something when Dr. Crusher says tells Troy that it was just a sudden burst of anger that came out of nowhere. It makes me wonder, like, an emotion without a preceding thought, right? Thinking about like a cognitive behavioral loop where your emotion stems from something. And so you're more likely to react in character, like that is literally your character, right? That set of patterns. But in this case, you just have a burst of something. And in Crusher's case, it was anger. I guess we're supposed to assume it's anger across the board because everyone is yelling, right? Picard and Riker having their spat.
Yeah. The bar fight is over being angry about and possessive about a table. Like, this is our table. This is our table.
Which is hard to believe is out of character because what's his face? Colm Meaney's character is a little
O'Brien
inclined
O'Brien will throw a punch.
Yeah.
I think it would have been more, to me, it would have been, I don't know, it would have made more sense to me if people had been hit with this emotion that they could process in a way, right? Like, I could see the 10 forward bar brawl, like that could make sense, right? But I struggle a little bit more with Geordi and Wesley and Crusher and Wesley. Like, I really had a harder time processing those interactions.
Poor Wesley.
Poor Wesley. It also was confusing to me. I mean, I feel like I'm not trying to CinemaSins this, but it was confusing to me how sometimes, like, Geordi was clearly impacted when he was arguing with Wesley, but then he wasn't impacted during the bar brawl, right? Because he's like, oh, why is everyone fighting?
They say that they say it's random, that they can't predict where these outbursts will happen. Presumably they're restricted to the ship, but yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, given how much regret and love Sarek shows through the mind meld, you would expect, something more in that vein to also show up somewhere.
Embarrassment, sorrow, none of that seems to manifest.
Finally get the Picard Crusher smooch that people are already waiting for in season 3.
There was some Picard Crusher ship baiting there. Like, they had some intimacy.
Those actors have to stand so close to each other in a scene. I don't know why things are filmed that way, but they're standing so close that it just invites the shipping.
So, beyond all that deep stuff, we're also 3 big Star Trek fans. So, we're going to go to 10 forward, and we're going to talk about stuff that we geeked about. I'll start with the Mozart concert that gets put on, or it's not exclusively Mozart, but the string quartet performance. Like, I love this dorky shit in Star Trek. I like when Lower Decks jokes about it. I love that, like, the writers clearly were like, well, this is a military ship, or this is a naval ship, but also it's in a future where we're peaceful and enlightened and so on. So what does that look like? And, like, in a place where, say, MASH, which is a military show set in the Korean War, would do, like, a shabby Christmas pageant that gets put on by the soldiers in order to try and amuse themselves, Star Trek has them preparing a classical music recital. And we see this, we see Riker playing his trombone, and we see various other things like this throughout the series. People, like, basically doing talent shows weekly, it seems. We talked about the ping pong tournament in Voyager. And, like, this idea that, like, there's this everyday life on the ship where, like, when Picard and Riker hear that Sarek might not come to the concert, they're crestfallen.
Yeah.
Riker might even say something like, we're still going to do the concert, right? And, like, and this concert it seems to be a string quartet and then, like, 20 to 30 people sitting on risers watching, and it's like just this little, like, come to my open mic little performance. And that is one of the things that I love about Star Trek, is that there's just these banal, mundane little things that the characters do that, like, you know, huge fan of Stargate. It is very rare in Stargate for anyone to do anything it's a hobby. Like, occasionally you see people, you know, reading a book in their bunk or something like that. And this I think is true across a bunch of sci-fi. Like, Star Wars, you get, like, a little bit of game playing while they're waiting to get from one place to another. But there's not this feeling that, like, the main characters have, like, a rich life outside of work. And Star Trek is just like, yeah, Data's been practicing, or at least going to rehearsals with these other people who don't have perfect musical performance, to put on a little string quartet for probably just the crew. And it just happened to, like, oh, Sarek's going to be here. He'd probably like to come.
Yeah.
That's stuff I find adorable and fun.
It's great.
It was only sad that we didn't have a Spot appearance.
Yeah, has Spot shown up? I forget when Spot appears in the show. That's Data's cat, Spot.
Sure. It might be not until season 4. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I do love me some Spot.
Yes.
Well, we have alluded to it already many times, but I thought Mark Leonard was extraordinary in this episode. I thought his performance was so good.
Playing Sarek.
I know that actually lots of people had great things to say about Patrick Stewart's performance. You know, I think Gregory mentioned early on that the mind meld scene is one long take. And Stewart he's incredible. Like, he does a really good job. But I really think that it's really challenging to play understated, to do an understated performance that communicates a really high density of emotion and a sort of an arc of emotional journey, I guess. I think Mark Leonard really does that. I mean, that one tear that they argue about later in the concert is like, it's very powerful, you know, that moment, like, that you see him reacting to art. And then even in that scene later when he's talking to Picard and he does the sort of gets stuck in the loop with illogical, he has such an understated performance. It felt so real.
Yeah, it was believable that he didn't realize that he was shouting until basically that point.
Yeah, I just really believed him, you know, in the way he played that character. And, you know, despite some of the flaws that I felt in watching it, I mean, he was a joy. Like, he was amazing. Just amazing to watch.
Yeah. I thought about this with Core too last episode. Like, this guy last played this character in what, the 70s? Like, or maybe he appeared in a movie, but like, it's surely been like years since he first played Sarek, and like to do all that with the added thing of like, here, there's this continuity to this character that I've been playing for so long and so sporadically. Right. Astonishing.
I don't know if Mark Leonard was going to the various conventions and signing papers and stuff, right? Like, was he in the fandom? Probably not. He had a rich career outside of being a Star Trek guy. So he's probably less entrenched in the space and picked up role up and played it amazingly with a different wife, right? Like a different actress playing alongside. Fucking legend. I was curious when they arrive on the ship, Sarek is facing away from the camera, and he turns around and brings his hood down. And I tried really hard to find footage of either the first time Romulans are revealed or some other later Sarek thing to see if that was mimicking that reveal.
There's a thing that Spock does maybe in Wrath of Khan when he first appears in that monastery. There's some famous thing of, I think, Spock putting his hood back like that.
Okay, that makes sense.
I do admire the commitment to making sure you're standing in the right direction for the transporter to have a dramatic turnaround.
Yes. To be like, oh, we're being over now? All right, let me face away.
That's he is a long-term diplomat because he was prepared for that entrance.
Power move.
So I was going to talk about great mind melds of Star Trek. But I've changed my mind as we've gone through this episode. So just like off the dome.
Let me mention, since we're not going to talk about mind melds, one of the greatest things about this mind meld is that they do my mind to your thoughts to my thoughts, and then cut away. We don't get like a montage of memories. We don't get, an image of Spock washing over us. We just cut away, and the next time we see them, they are in separate rooms experiencing each other.
The other thing I want to talk about is how 1960s this episode is. There are so many elements. The way people are talking, the way shots are framed, things like that bar fight that are so original series. When, like, third season, I guess I should say, starting Next Generation is very stilted, right? The acting is very sort of theater, awkward, hard to watch, especially in a sort of modern audience. Third season is when Next Generation becomes more natural, when it begins to feel like these are people talking to each other. But if you watch that scene where Picard and Riker, like the opening scene where Picard and Riker are walking down the hallway talking about how much they think Sarek is cool, it's so awkward. Patrick Stewart sounds so awkward and stilted here. And it just feels more old-fashioned than a late third season Next Gen episode should. But we also have things like the scene in which Picard is talking to Perrin about the fact that they think Sarek is sick, and she's facing away for most of that conversation. That is a very original series type of thing to do. It's not even that she was looking out the window, right? She was just facing away. There are scenes all the time of people looking out the window and someone else is in the conference room talking to them, but this was to nothing. The costuming of her and Sarek, of that whole party, is also very evocative.
She's wearing these enormous jewels. These just huge stones that are, they're 10 centimeters across. Like, they're enormous. It just all over her outfit.
Yeah, and she's got a partial hair covering. She's got something that kind of frames her face, but is really only sort of a strip across her hair. And I don't remember what that looked like in original series. I do feel like maybe Amanda had some sort of hair covering. But that bar fight, 100%. Like, I can immediately think of 3 bar fights from original series that is just like, and especially to have your, what do you call them? Your enlisted guy, right? You've got O'Brien, who is not an officer, rolling up, starting a fight. Like, that's very sort of stereotypical.
I think the boiling slime pits feel very very original series effects. Like, they're very iridescent, rainbow colored. They've got clearly got different colored gels shining on them to make it look like it's this different color stuff, and it's literally bubbling, like they put dry ice or bubblers or something underneath it. And that was the bit of the episode that I looked at and I was like, shows Star Trek used to be different.
Yep.
They wouldn't do that these days.
And the decorations in that room, that door was framed with a dark sort of metallic gunmetal gray with like big bulges on it in a way that felt very like lo-fi original series sort of structuring of that room. But yeah, this felt like especially now that you mentioned that this was sort of a Gene Roddenberry related episode in a certain way. Like, it feels like even more of an homage to original series by having that actor and this old-fashioned acting and set design and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah.
And I guess this is an episode that could have been an original series episode, I think. Like, I don't think there's anything that depends on any of the specific characters that happens in this episode, right? That it's not... This is just an adventure that they go on. It's not tied to any of the characters' histories.
Can you imagine William Shatner doing that scene that Patrick Stewart does in the Mind Meld?
Oh man,
I think that would be
Shatner saying, "I wanted to show you such tenderness,
such tenderness.
I do love you."
I don't think they could have pulled this off if Spock had been on the ship. I think that family dynamic would be too much to try to navigate
That is true.
On top of my dad is going mad or whatever. But I think you're right in terms of, like, they needed someone diplomatic so that Sackett could go around and ask, can this person do this instead, right? But yeah, it didn't have to be them. Anyway, thank you for indulging me in impromptu 1960s time.
Happy to.
Well, at the end of each episode, we pick the next thing we're watching based on the connection from this episode. And
I'm excited.
You should be.
I think you said that this just came to you. Like, you didn't have to deliberate at all. You just knew.
Yeah, it just came to me in a lightning bolt, so I knew. And I really appreciate all of the foreshadowing you all have helped seed. So this episode had a crew really influenced by these sort of powerful emotions that they struggled to deal with and express.
I have a guess, but go ahead.
So next time we'll be watching episode 9 of season 2 of Strange New Worlds, Subspace Rhapsody. That's the musical one.
Yes.
Hell yeah.
It's going to be a long episode on our parts, recording.
Are we going to do a musical episode?
I do not feel qualified to do a musical episode of Before the Future Came.
I am not a singer. Holy shit.
That's the musical episode of Strange New Worlds. You can find it on Paramount Plus or wherever you enjoy stealing Star Trek from. And that's it.
So next time, we'll be discussing Subspace Rhapsody on Before the Future Came. You can find links and show notes at beforethefuture.space, including those pictures, which, I don't know, there might be more than 3. We've got outfits to show, we've got bubble and goop. If you could, we would really appreciate you rating us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. You probably hear this from all of your podcasts, but it does seem to make a big difference for people encountering the show. Tell folks about the show if you like it. And we would love to get feedback and questions. If you've got a quick question you want to ask, you can submit it on co-host at cohost.org/beforethefuturecame. You can comment on each episode on our website, and you can write us an email if you've got a more detailed question at onscreen@beforethefuture.space.
I'm Lucy Arnold, and sometimes blog at intertextualities.com.
I'm Gregory Avery Weir, and you can find me at ludusnovus.net or on cohost at cohost.org/GAW.
And I'm Melissa Avery Weir, and I live at urson.net and on Mastodon at melissa@urson.life.
Our music is Let's Pretend by Josh Woodward, used under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license. Thanks for listening.
I'm sure we'll all live happily ever after, surrounded by butterflies, children, and laughter. It's a fairy tale story, so let's just pretend. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end. Happily ever after the end.
Those walls were too bright.
The walls were too bright.